Hey, my name is Adam Nayman, another Ringer video essay. The release this October of the much anticipated, at least by some, prequel Exorcist believer has put the spotlight back on William Friedkin's 1973 classic. Pretty much a consensus pick as one of the most memorable American horror movies ever made. For most viewers, The Power of the Exorcist, then and now, was bound up in this contradictory and uncomfortable depiction of evil that it made, in the form of an innocent but demonically possessed 12-year-old girl. It's a figure of pity and terror that discombobulated audience responses from the very first screenings, and which has obviously endured down the decades.
Fantastic movie.
It's really gross.
It was really terrific.
I want to see if it's going to make me throw up.
The Exorcist certainly did not invent the tradition of using children as faces of cinematic fear, but arguably represented its apex, especially in terms of reaching a mass audience. In this Ringer video essay, we're going to look at a long and pretty interesting list of movies both before and since The Exorcist, which feature evil, malevolent, or otherwise unwholesome children in important parts, and examine what it is about this archetype that compels and unsettles in almost every single different era, in almost every single different context, and into the present day.
But he kept on crying and making a noise. And I was afraid somebody would hear him, so I kept on hitting a mother!
In Maxwell Anderson's 1954 play The Bad Seed, a mother discovers that her beloved, picture-perfect daughter has inherited genetic traits from her birth father that make her basically evil, a prisoner of her own biology without possibility of cure or redemption. And after trying for a while to cover up for her little angel's crimes, the woman becomes terrified of what 6-year-old Rhoda is going to do next, and for good reason. Translated to the screen, The Bad Seed becomes an instant camp classic, a movie that's pitched right on that line between being, quite enjoyable and quite terrible. It includes sequences where characters debate the merits of nature versus nurture, but it's hard to take this sort of philosophical back and forth too seriously, especially since most of the adults in the movie, no matter how articulate they are just incredibly stupid in order for the plot to work. They don't recognize the very obvious signs that Rhoda is a stone-cold sociopath.
You wanted to win that penmanship medal very much, didn't you?
It's the only gold medal Miss Fern gives. And it was really mine. Everybody knew I wrote the best hand, and I should have had it.
Now, playing this part, a young actress named Patty McCormack was Oscar nominated for her performance. She's one of the youngest people ever nominated in the Best Supporting Actress category. And throughout the film, we see Rhoda lay waste to her underage classmates and even a downtrodden groundskeeper. And, give McCormack credit, her scenes included having to deliver some of the worst, most on-the-nose dialogue ever written.
Now, what do you give me if I give you a basket of kisses?
I'll give you a basket of hugs.
In the end, the film features Rhoda getting a pretty amazing comeuppance, a sort of punishment that was added by the studio on top of the play to keep the movie from seeming too bleak. There's a period where bad guys aren't supposed to get away with murder in American films, and it's a sort of deus ex machina ending that plays, as quite hilariously funny as little Rhoda gets hers. Not just from God, but from the studio itself. A year after the Summer of Love, this act of matricide suggests that the kids aren't all right. Now, of course, Night of the Living Dead isn't really about evil children. Most of the zombies in it are grown-ups. The controlling metaphor isn't generational warfare, sort of more about the Vietnam War, and George Romero trying to prod the relationship between audiences and unseen images of violence. But it's still interesting that Romero opted to push against taboos, including this zombie little girl in Night of the Living Dead. One thing about it is it showed that this is a truly ruthless movie, right? There's no thoughts or the spare for the feelings or the sensitivities of its audience. It's a movie that's going to go places that don't feel safe. And by the time Zack Snyder got around to making his own millennial version of the material in 2004's Dawn of the Dead, he borrowed that image all over again. And that film features a really quite horrific prologue, which reaches its peak when the character played by Sarah Polley encounters a young zombie girl in her hallway and is forced to run for her life, a nod back to Romero and a nod back to the potency of that figure.
What have you done to it? What
have you done to its eyes?
One of the most faithful literary adaptations of its era, Rosemary's Baby doesn't just reproduce the plot points and modish New York City backdrop of Ira Levin's best-selling source novel. It also replicates and really kind of exalts in Levin's diabolical use of limited point of view. In both the book and the film, it sure seems like the slim, anxious Rosemary Woodhouse, played by Mia Farrow, is at the center of a plot involving her friends, neighbors, and even her husband, to be unwittingly used as a vessel to give birth to the Antichrist. But can she and we really be sure that it's not just our minds playing tricks on us, especially given some of the ridiculous particulars of what Rosemary thinks is being done to her?
They planned everything right from the beginning. They probably made some sort of deal with Guy. They gave him success, and he promised them our baby to use in their rituals.
What we get in Roman Polanski's film, and it really is a brilliantly made movie, is a vision of a secular modern society that's haunted around the edges. There's that great shot in the movie of Time magazine reading, Is God Dead?, which is taken from a real copy of Time, which sort of shows that kind of skepticism and maybe irreligious attitude proliferating, but at the same time as this dark magic is being woven in the plot. As Rosemary Baby goes on, even the most everyday items start to vibrate with this sort of malign tension, and it's a testament to how well directed the movie is that years later, when you go on YouTube or on the internet, or when you see people talking about screenings of the film, they swear that they saw Rosemary's Baby at the end. They have a memory of what the child looks like. We don't actually see the baby in the film, but those are Polanski's powers of suggestion. He knew that actually showing the Antichrist would be a mistake. Better to leave such concepts to the imagination, which is where they consolidate their power in the first place.
How long are you planning to stay in Reagan?
Until she rots and lies stinking in the earth.
Rosemary's Baby doesn't really show you very much. The Exorcist shows you everything, to the point where it's sort of amazing that it got an R rather than an X rating, because I think at that point it might have been the most ferocious and violent and certainly one of those blasphemous American studio movies ever made. The barely suppressed subtext of the film is that it's really a story about puberty. It's about a 12-year-old girl who starts acting out, talking back to her parents, staying in bed when all anybody around her wants her to do is leave her room. I'm being a little glib, but not really. Those are the kind of cultural myths that the film digs into and sort of helped make it such a universal hit, because before this, horror movies weren't things that made $100 million. For decades, this was the biggest hit in the horror genre that Hollywood had ever made, and as a result, it spawned instantly all kinds of satire,
fuck this,
and rip-offs and knockoffs, but none of that could diminish the primal power of Linda Blair, sort of caught between girlhood and womanhood, in her nightgown in states of total vulnerability and abjection, whether tied to her bed or levitating above it. This broke down people's defense mechanisms. It's hard to react to it sort of ironically. The movie just kind of beat people into this state of terrified submission. It was also considered to be a great recruiting poster for the Catholic Church. The Exorcist never fully loses sight of the horror of coming of age. It made millions of Americans terrified of their teenagers and what demonic tendencies might be lurking somewhere in their bedrooms, in their classrooms, in their record collections, just waiting to be summoned into existence.
Reagan, why are you reading that stuff?
It's a movie that works because of all of its surface brilliance, but also because that subtext is so deep and, touches such a collective nerve that the movie broke records from day one.
What in God's name are you talking about?
Your son, Mr. Thorne. The son of the devil.
Worth noting that before he conjured up the script for The Omen, David Seltzer helped write Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which features a series of children so irritating that most of us want to see them either transformed into food or flushed down a chute to nowhere. It's a movie that really hates mean children.
You should open your mouth a little wider when you speak.
And so it wasn't exactly a massive leap for him to make up a story about the Antichrist, imagined in The Omen as the adopted, enigmatic 5-year-old son of a Washington power couple who have ties to the White House. The Omen draws shamelessly on the popularity and iconography of both Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. It takes certain religious horror tropes and mixes them with gory murder sequences that rhythmically are more like a 70s disaster movie than anything else. It's like one, decapitation set piece every 10 minutes. The Omen is pure big budget studio trash. It's a B movie with A-list production values, which is why you have Gregory Peck, who for decades was one of Hollywood's most upstanding leading men. He is the slow-on-the-take hero here, and the idea is that if Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird is worried that something's wrong with his kid, then obviously something's wrong with his kid. Now, as Damien, the child actor Harvey Stevens is actually not all that memorable. He doesn't do much except stare blankly. Most of the chills and most of the heavy lifting are provided by the extraordinary choral score by Jerry Goldsmith, which won the Academy Award for Best Original Score even over the inspirational theme from Rocky, and really is an example of how a couple of pieces of music well deployed can make a movie seem far more frightening and far more intense than it really is.
What kids? The disturbed kids in the work shed. The ones your wife's taking care of.
When The Brood became an underground hit at the end of the 1970s, David Cronenberg joked it was his version of the hugely acclaimed Hollywood hit Kramer vs. Kramer, a movie about the brutality of divorce and the toll it takes on parents and children alike. The difference, of course, was that Cronenberg, who'd exploded onto the scene a few years earlier with a series of transgressive, low-budget shockers made in his native Canada, supplemented emotional violence with the real thing. Seething with rage over her own childhood abuse, as well as the ongoing custody battle she's losing to her husband, Samantha Eggar's character Nola Carva has begun parthegenically birthing deformed children who act out her most aggressive impulses on her behalf. By splitting the difference between schlock and psychodrama, satirizing some of the sort of new agey, late 20th century, parapsychological movements that were gaining traction at the time, Cronenberg showed that he could touch a nerve.
Do you like it? That's psychoplasmics.
But it's the images in the film of these sort of weirdly faceless, vague, snow-jacketed children attaching and bludgeoning helpless adults. They're kind of goofy, but they're also really disturbing. They feel hugely unnatural. As for the final sequence, where you finally see Nola in her sort of glory as this twisted maternal goddess with her brood sort of, clinging to her and dropping from her body, that's the stuff that's kind of instantly iconic as a midnight movie and made The Brood extremely famous despite its low budget, and helped to propel Cronenberg to the status he holds now as sort of one of the most important horror filmmakers of all time.
She's my mother now. Hey, Mark. Don't fuck with me.
The Good Son is really about casting. And it's a brilliant idea, which is you take the most beloved kid in any American movie in decades, and you make him into a burgeoning serial killer. And supposedly, Macaulay Culkin's dad, acting kind of as his representation, insisted he do The Good Son as a condition for appearing in Home Alone 2. He didn't want his son to be sort of typecast, right? So this is a way you sort of show that he can stretch his acting muscles. Even though Joseph Rubin's a pretty good filmmaker, The Good Son is not a particularly well done thriller, but Culkin is quite fun and very game for what he's being asked to do as Henry Evans, a psycho in training who lets his cousin Mark in on a bunch of morbid secrets, revelations that Mark barely lives to regret. The secret to the entertainment value, I think, is actually how much some of these scenes could have been substituted into Home Alone.
What do you think this is, a game?
The bit where Henry takes a dummy named Mr. Highway and throws him off an overpass, causing a giant accident, is something that, Kevin McAllister or even Bart Simpson might have done. As the film goes on, Culkin really starts digging into the role, having an awful lot of fun with it. A scene where he confronts his mother over the supposedly accidental drowning death of his younger brother years earlier touches that same kind of pulpy, campy melodrama that you have in a movie like The Bad Seed.
Henry. Give it to me!
And even though a lot of people considered the film a disappointment artistically, it was actually a big hit at the time, showing that Culkin really did have, if not, you could either call it box office muscle or just enough kind of pop culture omnipresence to put this idea across.
Är du vampyr? Jag lever på blod.
As far as Hollywood movies go, Kirsten Dunst etched probably the most memorable performance of an underage bloodsucker in Interview with the Vampire. She really did get at the pathos of a woman who is destined to grow old in a child's body and all of the complexities and contradictions and frustrations of that fate. Now, that archetype is further developed in a very deftly executed Swedish film called Let the Right One In, This is about a preteen boy living in a sort of a drab housing block who becomes fascinated and then terrified by his new neighbor Eli, an androgynous cipher whose predatory habits are soon being whispered about throughout the entire neighborhood. Arriving at the pop cultural landscape around the same time as Twilight, Let the Right One In, is sort of substitutes gory shocks and very ambivalent, confused, complicated expressions of pre-adolescent love and desire for more glimmery, idealized YA romance. It was sort of seen as Twilight for the weird kid in class or Twilight for outsiders. And Thomas Alfredson's film version is good at not softening or cheapening or really sanitizing aspects of the source novel, which are quite harsh. Swedish film yielded a solid, slightly less transgressive American remake called Let Me In, which had the right tone but suffered from Chloe Grace Moretz's flat performance in a sort of challenging role, not as good as performer in the Swedish film.
Is she someplace where she can hear you?
No, she's not with me. She's with my husband at home.
Call your husband right now and tell him to get your family out of the house.
Anyone who's actually seen Jean Collet-Serra's bad taste classic Orphan knows there's one very good reason that it probably shouldn't be on this list of movies about evil children, or that it really only belongs if you give it a big old asterisk. But leaving aside such technicalities, Orphan really is one of the best evil kid movies of its era, if not ever. It piles on every conceivable genre gimmick, every absolutely kind of wackadoodle plot twist that you can imagine, en route to a hilariously convoluted and cathartic climax, which I remember the audience going nuts for at the screening I attended in Toronto like 15 years ago. The idea in the plot is that 9-year-old Esther, who dresses like a woman in her 60s and who really has this sort of odd, old-fashioned feel about her.
Oh, look! Little Bo Peep texts me. She wants her outfit back.
You can take a seat.
She's this tough, hardened survivor. She made her way through a series of Russian foster homes all the way to the US. Suffice it to say that she's actually even longer suffering than that, and all the pent-up anger she's had about being abandoned and discarded and pushed through the system is going to get unleashed on her new adoptive parents who have no idea what they're in for. I would say that if the Oscars actually meant anything, Vera Farmiga would have won for a performance in Orphan that just runs the gamut, from genuine devastating heartbreak to kind of wide-eyed, paranoia to badass action movie heroics. She does it all with a really great sense of bad taste comedy. And Isabel Fuhrman is just as good. She makes Esther into an indelible villain whose schemes, some of which involve self-harm, and some of which involve unbelievable cruelty towards innocent parties. They're just so hateful. You can't wait to see her get hers. For anyone who saw it on its first run, Orphan kind of is a small masterpiece. It's a nice memory of when mid-budget studio thrillers still had a little bit of personality to them. And I would actually say the recent prequel, Orphan First Kill, not too bad either if you get a chance to seek it out.
Everybody can think what they want. You can talk to whoever you want. It doesn't matter. I'm Sean. I love Anna, and nothing's going to change that. Nothing.
Birth is not a horror movie, exactly, and it's not really about an evil little kid either, although for most of Jonathan Glazer's film, we are guessing and second-guessing what precisely is going on, and the question of something malign and diabolical is very much in play. Nicole Kidman stars in Birth as Anna, a woman who's about to get remarried 10 years after the premature death by heart attack of her husband, the week of her wedding, which is really a kind of high-end society wedding to end all weddings, very well-to-do circle of friends. She's confronted by a strange 10-year-old boy who claims to be the living reincarnation of her dead husband, Sean.
Who are you? Let's go into the kitchen. I'll tell you there.
Are you gonna play a trick on me?
And who knows things with the dearly departed Sean, and also about Anna and about their friends and families that suggest something otherworldly may in fact be going on. There's no reason that this kid, who also says his name is Sean, should know any of this. It's interesting to note that with his cool, brooding look, 10-year-old Cameron Bright was actually a veteran of genre movies when he shot Birth. He had already appeared in The Butterfly Effect and in another demonic child movie called Godsend. And he really does hold his own as an actor in Birth opposite Kidman. There's something about his performance that is somewhat uncanny, that is unnerving, and it lets the film retain this aura of enigma until the very final moments when it has to show its hand, and a lot of people found what it's ultimately about, one of the explanations for what's going on, to be somewhat underwhelming or somewhat lacking. But up to that point, it's a movie that has a lot of promise and a lot of menace, and again carried by strong acting all around.
Listen, buddy, it's easy to misunderstand something when you hear it out of context.
Why would I not know the context? I am the context.
Lionel Shriver's 2003 novel, We Need to Talk About Kevin, was partially inspired by the Columbine massacre. More generally, it was trying to put a realistic frame around that cliche of the bad seed. Shriver's trying to dramatize how a parent might react to knowing that they're harboring a monster under their roof, how they might act, how they might feel, what they might do without descending into kind of cheesy horror movie narrative. In making the film, Scottish director Lynn Ramsay just opted for a wildly stylized visual presentation. She's a brilliant technical filmmaker. You see in the film Tilda Swinton placed in a variety of ugly, surreal domestic environments. The wallpaper and the props are ratcheting up the tension almost as much as the story. The loathing that Swinton's character has for this robotic, calculating boy is palpable, especially as the kid comes to be played in an older incarnation by Ezra Miller, and the movie becomes almost darkly comic. It's almost like a Looney Tunes cartoon, as Kevin charms everyone around him, but not out of affection, just mostly as a way of making his mother look like her concerns are fraudulent or hysterical. And she spends an awful lot of time seething after he has sort of made her look bad in front of her husband or in front of her friends or in front of the other characters in the film. In the absence of any supernatural elements, the movie doesn't go anywhere in that direction. The question of why Kevin turned out like he did, why he takes pleasure in torture and violence, whether he's capable of normal emotions, whether there's anything that his mother would have been able to do even if she had tried harder, or if it was even possible to try harder, is all left sort of hauntingly ambiguous. Some people might say that that suggests kind of an empty movie, a movie that doesn't really try and answer any of its own questions, or some might say that it is getting at something kind of just eternally profound and not pretending to tie it up with a bow. It's a film that certainly some people, when it was released, found very disturbing, and it's sort of the gold standard as far as 21st century treatments of this trope go. Wonder if you guys think we missed anything on our list, if there's movies that you think should have been included or movies that you think should have been left out. As always, if that's the case, drop a comment, let us know, what we got wrong. And for those of you who always enjoy these and give us nice feedback, we always appreciate it. We want to keep doing them, and so we will. See you guys next time, and thanks.